Donald Trump picked up the phone and called Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. His message was blunt, direct, and explosive. Allow U.S. troops to cross into Mexican territory to take on the drug cartels. It was a move that would have shattered decades of diplomatic norms and triggered a political firestorm on both sides of the border. But Sheinbaum didn't flinch. She didn't stall. She said no, immediately and unapologetically. Our territory is inviolable, she told him. Sovereignty is not for sale. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was the kind of high-stakes geopolitical standoff that rarely makes headlines until it's too late. Behind closed doors, two world leaders collided over the future of border security, drug enforcement, and national pride. And now that private phone call is public, and the consequences could redefine U.S.-Mexico relations for an entire generation. What really happened during that call? Why did Trump push so hard for military involvement? And what does Sheinbaum's defiant stand tell us about the shifting balance of power in North America? This isn't just about cartels. It's about control, sovereignty, and a brewing conflict that's about to get a lot more public. On the morning of April 16th, a high-stakes phone call took place, one that could quietly alter the trajectory of U.S.-Mexico relations for years to come. U.S. President Donald Trump, known for his hardline policies and unfiltered diplomacy, reached out directly to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum with a proposal that, in his words, was meant to help fight the surge of drug trafficking and fentanyl smuggling pouring across the southern U.S. border. But his version of help came with a cost that Mexico would never accept. Trump didn't offer intelligence. He didn't offer equipment or funding. He proposed something far more explosive, the deployment of U.S. military troops into Mexican territory, not on the border, not in a joint base, but inside the sovereign nation of Mexico itself. His plan? To have American forces assist in dismantling the country's sprawling drug cartels and fentanyl production networks, groups that Washington had already labeled foreign terrorist organizations. For Trump and his allies, this was about taking the fight to the source. For Mexico, it was about something else entirely: sovereignty, pride, and constitutional integrity. President Sheinbaum's response was immediate, unequivocal, and deeply rooted in national history and principle. "No, President Trump," she said. "Our territory is inalienable. Sovereignty is cherished and defended." In that moment, Sheinbaum wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for generations of Mexicans who have lived through foreign interventions, covert CIA operations, and years of U.S. pressure that often blurred the line between partnership and dominance. Her words weren't diplomatic fluff. They were a thunderclap, a red line drawn in bold ink. This wasn't an isolated disagreement. It's part of a much larger, escalating drama between Washington and Mexico City, fueled by rising deaths from fentanyl overdoses in the United States, cartel-fueled violence in Mexico, and the political urgency on both sides to show results. For Trump, who's been campaigning on promises of border crackdowns and national security, the optics of sending U.S. troops to clean up the cartels plays well with his base. But for Sheinbaum, accepting such a move would mean political suicide, constitutional violation, and the betrayal of a deeply held belief that Mexico's internal problems must be solved by Mexicans. It's worth remembering that Trump has already classified Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, a move that legally gives the U.S. far broader authority to intervene militarily or otherwise. His administration has also ramped up surveillance over Mexican territory, using CIA drones to locate drug labs and monitor trafficking routes. While Sheinbaum has allowed some cooperation, such as intelligence sharing and limited aerial reconnaissance, she's remained fiercely opposed to any boots-on-the-ground presence. In her words, collaboration, yes. Invasion, never. This showdown is about more than two leaders on a phone call. It's a collision of two worldviews, one that believes in unilateral action and overwhelming force, and another that insists on mutual respect and national dignity. And at the center of it all is a border, one that now feels more like a front line. Despite Claudia Sheinbaum's firm stance on sovereignty, her presidency has, up to this point, been characterized by calculated cooperation with the United States. Early in her term, she took steps that many considered diplomatic olive branches. She deployed 10,000 Mexican soldiers to the northern border in a clear effort to stem the flow of migrants into the U.S. and move, widely seen as a response to mounting pressure from Washington. She allowed American drones to fly over northern Mexican territory, hunting for clandestine fentanyl labs operated by some of the country's most dangerous cartels. She opened intelligence sharing channels and made public commitments to fight organized crime. In short, Sheinbaum has done more than most of her predecessors to work alongside the U.S. without ceding control. But none of it has been enough for Donald Trump. Even with these significant gestures, Trump has continued to escalate his demands. He's not interested in partnerships defined by mutual respect. He wants control, action, results, and headlines. He sees Mexico's struggle with cartel violence not as a joint security issue, but as a justification for American military intervention, and he's not alone. Conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation have openly floated the idea of unilateral UU military strikes against Mexican cartels. In their view, Mexico has lost control of vast swaths of its territory, and if the Mexican government won't act decisively, then Washington should step in and do it for them. These arguments, once fringe, are now moving into the political mainstream, and Sheinbaum knows it. Trump's campaign of pressure doesn't stop at diplomacy or security. It's economic, coercive, and deeply strategic. Earlier this year, he imposed sweeping 25% tariffs on Mexican exports, specifically targeting cars, steel, and aluminum, industries that form the backbone of Mexico's manufacturing sector. The goal was clear: punish Mexico economically until it capitulates on security cooperation. But it didn't stop there. In a stunning escalation, Trump also threatened to impose additional tariffs over a separate issue entirely, a water dispute tied to a decades-old treaty. Mexico, in compliance, agreed to send water to drought-stricken Texas, but the message was unmistakable. This was transactional diplomacy at its rawest. Give us what we want or suffer economically. Claudia Sheinbaum now finds herself caught in an excruciating position. On one hand, she must maintain the crucial alliance with the United States, Mexico's most important trading partner, and a powerful neighbor capable of causing serious economic harm. On the other, she must uphold the dignity of the Mexican state and protect its constitutional sovereignty. Both principles she has publicly sworn to defend. The stakes couldn't be higher. Accepting a U.S. troop presence would likely provoke massive domestic backlash, stir nationalist outrage, and shatter her reputation as a leader who defends Mexico's autonomy. But continued refusal could mean deeper economic retaliation, increased diplomatic hostility, and further pressure from Washington. That possibility of American boots on Mexican soil stirs up painful historical memories and deep national trauma. To many Mexicans, it is unthinkable. To others in Washington, it's becoming increasingly plausible. And that growing divide between perception and reality, between diplomacy and force, is what makes this moment so dangerously combustible. The economic stakes of this confrontation are immense, and the consequences are already rippling through Mexico's fragile financial landscape. When Donald Trump reimposed 25% tariffs on Mexican exports, specifically targeting vehicles, steel, and aluminum, it wasn't just a trade maneuver. It was a targeted blow aimed at Mexico's industrial heartland. These industries aren't just economic sectors. They are the lifeblood of entire regions, employing millions and anchoring the country's export-driven economy. For a nation still recovering from pandemic-era disruptions, supply chain breakdowns, and inflation, these tariffs hit like a second wave of crisis. And the numbers are already starting to show the strain. The International Monetary Fund, which had earlier projected modest economic growth for Mexico in 2025, has now reversed course, predicting a 0.3% contraction instead. A shrinking economy means fewer jobs, less investment, and growing political unrest, all of which could severely erode President Sheinbaum's popularity at home, no matter how admired she is abroad. If the U.S. doubles down on economic pressure, and especially if new sanctions or tariffs are introduced in the lead-up to the U.S. election cycle, the Mexican economy could be pushed into a recession, one that it might not be able to climb out of quickly. But it's not just about trade balances and GDP forecasts. The security dimension is even more volatile, and in some ways, far more terrifying. Mexico is a country at war with itself, and the numbers are staggering. Cartels now exert operational control over nearly 1/3 of the national territory, according to estimates from U.S. military analysts. These are not mere criminal gangs. They are well-armed, deeply entrenched paramilitary forces with their own command structures, intelligence networks, and economic empires built on trafficking, extortion, and terror. They operate with impunity in some regions, outgunning local police, co-opting state officials, and using violence as a tool of governance. Under Sheinbaum's administration alone, more than 8,000 people have gone missing, a staggering figure that translates to 41 disappearances every single day. These disappearances are not isolated tragedies. They are a systematic method of control used by cartels to eliminate threats, silence dissent, and terrify communities into submission. The fear is constant. Families search for loved ones in mass graves and abandoned properties. Forensic teams uncover charred bones, incinerators, and personal belongings, horrific remnants of what some are calling extermination centers. And yet, justice remains elusive. Investigations stall. Politicians deflect. The system appears paralyzed. President Sheinbaum is walking a razor's edge. On the world stage, she's being praised for her measured diplomacy and her ability to manage a notoriously volatile Trump. The international press hails her as a shrewd negotiator. Some call her the Trump whisperer, others the anti-Trump. She's been able to keep the peace, de-escalate trade threats, and project an image of calm leadership, but at home, she's presiding over a nation that is unraveling at the seams. Her approval ratings remain high, but they are fragile, held aloft by hope, not necessarily results. Militarily, the consequences of allowing U.S. troops into Mexico could be catastrophic. The very idea of foreign soldiers operating on Mexican soil reawakens deep historical wounds. The memory of past invasions, of the U.S. occupation of Mexico City in 1847, and more recent covert operations. It would not just spark outrage in Parliament or among opposition leaders. It would inflame the streets. It would galvanize nationalist protests, trigger violent backlash from both leftist groups and cartel factions, and potentially drag the country into a constitutional crisis. Mexico's military and intelligence communities, long wary of American involvement, might resist such cooperation outright, and the already fragile rule of law could begin to break down in critical regions. Even from the American perspective, this is a high-risk strategy. A U.S. troop deployment in Mexico would represent a fundamental shift in hemispheric policy, one that could backfire spectacularly. Military action might provoke more instability, not less. It could inflame anti-American sentiment across Latin America, draw international condemnation, and entangle the U.S. in a foreign conflict with no clear exit strategy. And it would mark a dangerous precedent, using military force against a sovereign neighbor under the guise of counter-narcotics operations. In the end, this crisis is not just about what happens next. It's about how much longer this geopolitical balancing act can hold. With a deteriorating economy, escalating violence, and political pressure mounting from all sides, Sheinbaum is fighting battles on multiple fronts. If she falters, if the line she's drawn around sovereignty begins to blur, then what we're witnessing may not just be a diplomatic dispute. It could be the beginning of a profound rupture between two nations that have long been bound by proximity, but increasingly divided by power. If the current path holds, if Trump or a future American administration continues to ramp up pressure on Mexico without crossing the line into military escalation, we may find ourselves locked in a long, tense standoff that quietly reshapes the political DNA of North America. In this version of the future, the confrontation doesn't erupt into outright conflict, but it simmers relentlessly, persistently, dangerously, just beneath the surface. Claudia Sheinbaum remains firm. She keeps her promises to the Mexican people, refusing to cede 1 inch of sovereignty. There are no U.S. boots on Mexican soil, no joint task forces marching through cartel-controlled territory, no high-profile military interventions launched from across the Rio Grande. Instead, what we see is an uneasy, reluctant form of cooperation, one defined more by necessity than by trust. When intelligence is shared, drones continue to patrol the skies in coordinated surveillance missions, and diplomatic phone calls are made behind closed doors, carefully choreographed to avoid public embarrassment or political fallout. But the relationship is brittle. Every fentanyl overdose in the U.S. becomes political ammunition. Every cartel-linked massacre in Mexico becomes another reason for American pundits to demand action. In Washington, voices grow louder, on cable news, on the campaign trail, in think tank white papers, calling for a harder line. They accuse Mexico of weakness, of complicity, of negligence. Meanwhile, in Mexico, national pride festers into resentment. The public sees the pressure campaign not as help, but as imperialism wrapped in concern. Politicians who once backed limited cooperation begin to question whether the United States can be trusted at all. And all the while, the situation on the ground grows more volatile. The cartels are not waiting. They adapt. They evolve. Their power grows in the vacuum left by political gridlock. In some parts of Mexico, they become the de facto government, filling roles the state cannot. Disappearances continue. The violence remains sporadic but unrelenting. Security forces fight endless battles with limited resources and under immense pressure not to make a misstep that could ignite international scandal. In this scenario, there is no formal invasion. No line is crossed that sends shockwaves through the United Nations or triggers breaking news alerts. But the danger is still there. Silent, corrosive, and mounting. It's the danger of unresolved tension, of fragile cooperation masking deep mistrust. And like any prolonged standoff in history, it creates conditions where a single spark, an ambush gone wrong, a drone crash in cartel territory, a cartel attack that kills American citizens, could ignite something far worse. This is the standoff that everyone pretends is stability. But beneath the surface, it's only buying time.